There is a kind of silence that the world rarely understands. It is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It is the silence of someone who has said everything to the walls, to the air, to a person who was never truly listening. Carl Jung spent his life studying the interior world of human beings, the deep psyche beneath the surface. And what he found there was this: the most profound transformations in a person's life do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly. They settle in without ceremony. By the time anyone notices, the transformation is already complete. When an empath goes quiet, you are not watching the beginning of something. You are witnessing the end. Jung believed that the human psyche carries two worlds simultaneously: the outer world of relationships, pain, obligations, and social performance, and the inner world of symbols, feeling, and deep truth. For most people, these two worlds exist in tension. But for the empath, the boundary between them is extraordinarily thin. What others feel, the empath absorbs. What others suppress, the empath senses. What remains unspoken in a room, the empath hears as clearly as if it were shouted. This is not a gift they chose. It is the architecture of who they are. Jung called this heightened interior awareness the function of feeling, not emotion in the reactive sense, but perception through emotional intelligence. It is one of the four primary functions of the psyche. And in the empath, it operates at full volume, all of the time. They do not simply observe the emotional landscape of a relationship. They live inside it. They breathe it. They carry it home with them, long after the conversation has ended. This is why the empath invests so deeply. Not because they are naive, not because they lack discernment, but because their psyche is wired to attach through feeling, to connect through understanding. When they love someone, they do not love the surface version. They love the full interior person, the wounds, the contradictions, the potential that perhaps even the other person cannot yet see in themselves. And this is also why the silence, when it finally comes, is so absolute. Before the silence, there is always effort. Jung wrote that the path toward individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself, is rarely chosen willingly. It is forced upon us by the failure of our lesser strategies. For the empath, the lesser strategy is overgiving. It is the belief that if they explain clearly enough, love deeply enough, sacrifice generously enough, the relationship will eventually balance itself. The other person will rise to meet them. For months, sometimes years, the empath tries. They adjust their tone, time their conversations for the right moment. They soften what is sharp and clarify what is misunderstood. They offer patience when they are exhausted. They offer warmth when they are depleted. They hold space for another person's growth while quietly shrinking their own needs to fit into whatever room is left. This is not weakness. Jung would say it is the shadow of their greatest strength. The same capacity for empathy that makes them extraordinary also makes them vulnerable to self-erasure. Because when you are gifted at feeling what others feel, it becomes frighteningly easy to prioritize their experience over your own, to dismiss your own pain as an inconvenience, to convince yourself that your discomfort is less valid than their struggle. But the psyche keeps score. This is one of Jung's most enduring insights. What we suppress does not disappear. It accumulates. It grows heavier, finds its way into our dreams, our bodies, our quiet moments. The empath may smile through the exhaustion. They may continue showing up, be slow. A slow and irreversible accounting is taking place. Every time they expressed hurt and were dismissed, it was recorded. Every time they asked for reciprocity and received deflection, it was noted. Every time they made themselves smaller to preserve someone else's comfort, the psyche filed it away. Not in anger, not in resentment, but in a kind of quiet grief that has no name in ordinary language. Jung understood grief not simply as the mourning of what is lost, but as the mourning of what was never truly real. The empath does not only grieve the relationship as it exists, they grieve the relationship they believed was possible. The version that could have been, if only the other person had been willing to meet them there. This is a particular kind of sorrow, loving a potential more than a reality, and slowly coming to understand that potential was never going to arrive. There is a moment, and Jung would recognize it immediately, as a moment of psychic recalibration, when the empath stops waiting. It does not feel dramatic from the inside. It feels almost like nothing, a quieting, a settling. as if something that had been vibrating at high frequency has finally, gently, stilled. From the outside, it is easy to miss. The empath is still present. They still respond when spoken to. They still fulfill their obligations. But something fundamental has changed. The emotional door, which was once held open with both hands, has been allowed to drift closed, not slammed, not locked, simply released. Jung called this the withdrawal of projection. When we invest deeply in another person, we project onto them. We see not only who they are, but who we hope they are, who we need them to be. The empath, with their extraordinary capacity for depth, projects powerfully. They see potential, hidden wounds, the person beneath the person, and they love that deeper version unconditionally. But when the evidence accumulates, when pattern after pattern confirms that the other person either cannot or will not inhabit that deeper version, the projection begins to collapse. Not in bitterness. In clarity, the empath begins to see the person as they actually are, rather than as they hoped they would become. And this clarity, while painful, is also a form of liberation. The silence that follows is not abandonment. It is the empath returning to themselves. It's recollecting the energy they had scattered outward, gathering back the parts of themselves that had been stretched thin across the needs and moods and demands of someone else. Jung would call this the beginning of individuation, the self calling itself home. Carl Jung wrote that the most dangerous moment in any relationship is not the argument. It is the silence that follows the last argument the empath decides not to have. Because that silence is not absence. It is presence of a different kind. It is the presence of someone who has made a decision so deep inside themselves that no words are needed to confirm it. The decision has already been felt, already been lived. By the time the quiet becomes visible to others, it has been true for a long time. Empaths do not detach impulsively. This is something the outside world consistently misunderstands. The person who watches them grow quiet often thinks something specific must have happened. A final incident. A breaking point. A single moment that changed everything. But the empath knows the truth. There was no single moment. There were 1,000 small moments, each one adding its weight to a scale that was already tipping long before anyone thought to look. Jung described the psyche as a self-regulating system. When one side becomes too burdened, the other compensates. When the conscious mind overextends itself in one direction, pouring empathy outward, carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be theirs, the unconscious begins its correction. Slowly at first, then with increasing certainty, the empath begins pulling their energy inward, not as punishment, as survival. This withdrawal happens in layers. The first layer, the empath stops initiating. They stop being the one who reaches out, who checks in, who keeps the emotional current flowing. They tell themselves they are simply giving space. But the truth is deeper. They are learning without consciously meaning to, whether the connection can sustain itself without their constant tending. In most cases, the answer they receive confirms what they already feared. In the second layer, they stop explaining themselves. Where once they would have carefully articulated why something hurt or how a pattern affected them, they now simply observe. The words form, but they do not leave. Because the empath has learned, not bitterly, but clearly, that speaking does not always lead to being heard. And the energy required to speak into a void is energy they can no longer afford to spend. In the third layer, and this is the one that Jung would find most significant, the empath stops hoping for a different outcome. This is not despair. It is something more mature than despair. It is acceptance. The recognition that this relationship, in its current form, will not give them what their soul requires. And the soul, Jung believed, will not be denied indefinitely. It will find its way toward what it needs, even if that path leads through silence and withdrawal. There is a common misreading of the empath's silence. People interpret it as coldness, as emotional withholding, as passive punishment disguised as distance. But Jung's psychology offers a more nuanced understanding. The silence is not directed at anyone. It is directed toward something, toward the empath's own interior world, which has been neglected for too long. Jung introduced the concept of the self, not the ego. It's not the conscious personality. the deeper, organizing center of the psyche. The self knows what the person needs, even when the ego is too afraid or too attached to admit it. And when the empath has spent too long ignoring what the self requires: connection, reciprocity, genuine understanding, the safety to be fully known, the self begins to assert itself. It withdraws investment from what is not nourishing, redirects energy toward what can sustain life. The silence, then, is the sound of the self, reclaiming its resources. It is the psyche choosing integrity over familiarity. Clarity, in Jung's framework, is one of the most powerful psychological states a person can inhabit. When the projections have dissolved, when the hoping has given way to seeing, when the energy has been gathered back inward, the empath is no longer operating from need. They are operating from knowledge. They know what the relationship was. They know what it cost them. They know with a certainty that lives below words that the version of themselves who kept overextending is no longer who they are willing to be. The empath who has gone quiet is not broken. They are not bitter. They are not closed. They are, in the truest Jungian sense, individuating. They are becoming more fully themselves. They are integrating the painful knowledge of what was given and what was not returned. And they are using that knowledge to build something sturdier. A self that is no longer held hostage by the hope of being understood by someone who is never willing to try. The return to self is not a closing off from the world. It is a homecoming. The empath does not become less capable of feeling. They become more selective about where they allow that feeling to flow. They begin to understand, perhaps for the first time, that empathy is a resource, not an unlimited one, and that the people who deserve access to it are those who will handle it with care. And here is what Jung might say to the person who is watching from the outside, wondering what happened, wondering what changed, wondering how to reach the empath who has grown so still. He would say this: you are not witnessing withdrawal, you are witnessing arrival. The empath has arrived somewhere true, somewhere quiet and strong and deeply their own. And if you want to meet them there, you will need to bring something real, not promises, not gestures, the performance of understanding, but genuine presence, consistent safety, the willingness to be known as honestly as they were always willing to know you. Because the empath's silence is not a wall, it is a question. And the question is simply this: are you capable of the depth this requires? If the answer is yes, and if that answer is demonstrated in action rather than words, then the door that closed so quietly may, in time, open again. Not the same door. A better one, built on truth rather than hope. On reality rather than projection. On the kind of mutual understanding that Jung believed was the highest purpose of any human connection. But if the answer is no, or if it arrives too late, or dressed in the wrong words, then the empath will simply remain where they are, whole, still, at peace in the silence they were once afraid of, because they have discovered what Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to teach. The greatest relationship any person will ever have is the one they build with the truth of who they actually are. And once an empath finds their way back to that truth, nothing else will ever feel worth leaving it for.